Good evening. Welcome. My name is Sarah Blumenfeld, and I work for the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation. I just want to give that typical announcement of to silence your cell phones before the program gets started. I think I'm leaning on something here. I want to thank our sponsors for tonight, the California section of the American Chemical Society and the Mervyn L. Brenner Foundation. I'd also like to recognize and thank our foundation board member, Melanie Brinkman, who's here tonight, and as well as our Friends of the Lafayette Library President, Ellen Reinchess. It's the foundation, friends, sponsors, donors, and your ticket purchase that all contribute to keeping this library open 7 days a week with a very strong professional library staff and a terrific collection, which we're growing every day. So thank you all for your support tonight. I would just want to make a couple of announcements of upcoming programs. Next month, we will explore the underwater wilderness and robot submarines with the Marine Applied Research and Exploration Organization from right here in our San Francisco Bay. And in June, on the 15th, we have a program on medical marijuana. So those will be our two final Science Cafe for the summer, and then we'll break for the summer and come back in the fall. If you're interested in either of those programs and you are not receiving our newsletter, we have a sign-up sheet out in the lobby where you can sign up for AdLib. It goes out on Fridays and just keeps you up to date on programs. So I'd like now to introduce you to Orlando Guzman. He is one of our youth services assistant librarians, and he's going to introduce our speaker tonight. Orlando, thank you for coming.
Thank you all for coming. So I was asked to introduce our speaker for the day because I've been interested in computer graphics and computer graphics animation for a long time. So, I'm just going to make the introduction very brief. We're welcoming tonight LucasArts ILM senior layout artist Adam Schnitzer, and he has worked in the industry over 20 years. So we are going to basically, he's going to just introduce himself and give you a little presentation, and then that will be followed by a Q&A session. So let's welcome Adam.
Hi. So, what in the world is 3D layout? Many of you are probably wondering. Layout is one of those words that means different things in different contexts. So here is a definition of what layout is in the context of animation. Layout is the art of staging and framing an animated scene. So let's take a look at some 3D layout from Toy Story 2 that I worked on back in 1998.
What's a cowboy without his hat?
Buzz! 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 Get behind the tires! Jesse! Let go of the plane!
What, are you crazy?
Just pretend it's the final episode of Woody's Roundup!
But it was canceled! We never saw if you made it!
Well, then let's find out together!
Okay. Now, if you've never seen layout before, you're probably thinking, boy, that is some bad animation. And you would be right, but it's good layout. I was a landscape painter before I was a layout artist. And one of the practices of painting is it's a good idea to rough in all of your big shapes first. Work out your general composition, work out your color harmonies before you get into the details. Because you may find it's always very tempting to go to the details first. And I want to paint that eye, or I want to paint the shape of that branch. But if you go in too early to work on the details, you may find later, as your composition develops, you have to wipe out the details because they're all too small or too big or in the wrong place. So that's what layout is. Layout is about working out the big shapes establishing the overall cinematic design of a sequence before sending the shots down the production pipeline, where other artists will flash out the details of the animation and the lighting and the visual effects. So in the olden days, before the invention of virtual space and 3D animation, layout was a 2D art form. The layout artist's job was to draw a background picture and design how the characters would fit into it. This kind of layout is now called traditional layout. So with the invention of virtual reality, layout evolved to become a 3D discipline, adopting the language and the techniques of live-action filmmaking. Here is some layout footage from Pixar's movie Ratatouille. I should mention some of the footage that I'll show tonight I've worked on, some I haven't. This is one that I haven't. This is a general talk about layout, so I'm using different kinds of footage to illustrate the point. So let's take a look at this.
Ugh, your sleeves look like you threw up on them. Keep your hands and arms in, close to the body, like this, see? Always return to this position. Cook smooth, fast, sharp utensils, hard metal, keep your arms in. You will minimize cuts and burns and keep your sleeves clean. Mark of a chef, messy apron, clean sleeves.
The layout artist in the virtual world is much like the director of photography on a live-action set. Layout deals with the most fundamental questions of filmmaking. Where do I put the camera? What lens should I use? Where should the actors stand and how should they move? Before layout work can get underway, you like my little sound effect there? The first thing you need, of course, is a story. So the story department is where the story is developed. The main difference between the story teams of the 1940s and those of today is they wore ties back then. And also now there's women involved in developing stories. Stories for animation aren't just written, they're actually drawn at the same time they're being written. I worked with a guy named Joe Ranft, who was one of the great story artists at Pixar and Disney, and he used to always say, the story isn't done until it works in the boards. So pictures and words evolve together on an animated movie. The editorial department, under the direction of the director, takes the storyboards, adds sound, and turns them into what is called an animatic, which is a kind of a comic book movie. This is an animatic. The animatic is critical for establishing the pace of the action and the timing of the dialogue. So this is a little animatic from Minions.
Look at tú. Mola.
As the story starts to take shape, all these new characters need to be designed. That happens in the art department. And then they need to be modeled, textured, and rigged so that they can be posed and animated. You'll also need a set and some props and all the things that the script says are in the story. You also need recorded dialogue. Layout cannot get started without voice because voice recording is critical to the timing of the action. Now, traditional approach to voice recording is to bring your actors into a recording studio and record them one by one. So if there's a conversation between two actors, the actor that you're recording has to imagine the sound of the other actor. Of course, they see what they're saying on the script, but they don't get to interact with that other other actor. So here's a few voice recording sessions from the first Toy Story movie.
Buzz Lightyear! Any other toy would give up his moving parts just to be you. You got wings. You glow in the dark. Your helmet does that whoosh thing.
But what if Andy gets another dinosaur? A mean one. I'll get replaced. I just don't think I can take that kind of rejection.
I worked on the movie Rango a while ago, and one of the innovations that Gore Verbinski, the director of Rango, brought to the animation world from the live-action filmmaking world was the idea of recording the lines of dialogue not one by one in a sound booth, but actually on a sound stage with all the actors together. So the idea was to give the actors a chance to interact with one another and play off each other and hopefully get a more natural rhythm to the dialogue. The actors on the set started calling these sessions emotion capture sessions, kind of a play on motion capture, which is a technique for capturing physical motion. So here's a couple of moments from those sessions.
Oh, Beans, hold on, don't worry. I got a plan. Help! Open the door! Okay, plan B. What? Means you're mumbling. Please don't do that. I'm trying to think.
Please say one more time.
As long as that sign says sheriff, you can believe that there's law and order in this town. But without law and order, ruminate on that.
You see, they also shot it.
Starts
we
out
used some of their
slow,
footage
like a
from
fungus.
these recording sessions in our
Once it's
layouts
across
for
word,
the animation.
accusations start flying, neighbor turns on neighbor. Pretty soon, we're eating our children. Dogs and cats are getting together to create all sorts of unnatural mutant aberrations. Oh, evening, Gordy. Now, you get back on in there and you assert yourself, and I think you'll find the people of this here town to be surprisingly hospitable.
Thank you, Sheriff.
What? Not you again.
I stand corrected.
So, once the story is approved and the dialogue is recorded and all the necessary characters, props, and sets are designed, modeled, rigged, and textured, then, finally, layout work can begin. To do his or her job, the layout artist loads the 3D assets and the audio into the animation program on the computer and sets about posing the characters, blocking out the action, and recording all of that with a virtual camera. The layout artist refers to the animatic to see what kind of staging the director has in mind. Going from the 2D world of storyboards to the 3D world of layout can be tricky. Interpretation and adjustments are often required. So here's both some layout footage and some final footage, side by side or one on top of another, from Blue Sky Studios' Ice Age 2. It's the job of layout to provide a solid cinematic framework for all the departments downstream. The layout artist creates simple poses that indicate the key points of action for each shot and records the action with a virtual camera. Like a painter working out the big shapes of the composition, the director uses layout to work out the cinematic structure of the movie. Whereas an animator will take, say, 2 weeks to work on a single shot, a layout artist will do 20 shots in that amount of time. So that means animation is way more labor-intensive than layout. And that's why it makes sense to work out all your big decisions in layout, because once it goes to animation, it gets very expensive to change your mind. So that's why layout's a place where you work out the cinematic design, and then everybody else finishes the movie downstream. So there are different aspects to layout. One part of doing layout is just composing pictures. In that sense, it's based on all the stuff you learn about in art school. Layout, as I say, is the art of composing pictures. But with the complication that, unlike painting and photography, film takes place in time. So the things in the frame keep moving and changing. Here's a good example of an evolving composition from Schindler's List, directed by Steven Spielberg. This is what you would call a oneer. A oneer is many shots in one, and Steven Spielberg is great at combining what could be a whole bunch of shots into one shot that just evolves. start out as a close-up, then we're in an over-the-shoulder shot, on a medium shot, and they pass behind his head, so I've kind of a wide shot over the shoulder, then we're in a close-up, and then we're in a two-shot.
Yes, sir.
Layout is also the art of storytelling. In a film, each shot has a purpose. It's there to show the audience events as they unfold and to reveal each new moment of the story in a certain order. It's the job of layout to understand the purpose of each shot and to make sure that that information that's supposed to be expressed by the shot comes through to the audience. This is some footage from A Bug's Life, which was the first animated feature that I worked on back in 1997.
Just about had it with these losers. Flaming death! I hold in my hand the match that decides whether two bugs live or die this very evening. In a moment, I will light this trail of matches leading to a sheet of flypaper. Doused in light of the lens, aimed directly at the flypaper, are tuck and roll! The pill bug cannonball! The cannon will be triggered by Dim, trained to jump at the sound of this bell, set to go off in 15 seconds.
All right. Let's see. Layout uses the tools of cinematography then. Character blocking, the camera frame, lensing, camera movement, point of view, to help express the mood and meaning of each story moment. The question layout answers isn't what is going to happen, it's how will it be shot. Because the way that it's shot will very much affect how the audience feels about it and who they empathize with in the story. So, how will the action be framed? How will the characters be posed? How will the pacing be? Will it be a close-up? Will it be a medium shot? Will it be a wide shot? Will it be a bird's eye view or a worm's eye view? Will the camera move on a crane? Will it move on a dolly? Or is it better just to let the camera stand still? And if everybody knows all those clips, you win the prize tonight. All right. Did you get them all? I bet you did. The art of layout also involves thinking beyond individual shots to the sequence of shots as a whole. Composing shots for good cutting is one of the special skills of the camera operator, whether in the real world or the virtual one. I'm going to take a moment now to talk about our tools that we use to do layout. In 2005, I was hired by ILM to work on, with the software engineers in R&D to help develop a proprietary tool for layout for the Lucasfilm companies. The idea for the project was the brainchild of George Lucas, and I was fortunate to be able to work with him over a stretch of time to help him realize this software idea, which was to provide a 3D animation and editing program that non-computer users, like directors or artists, could use to stage and plan the action of their films in 3D. He said to me, it's got to be something somebody can learn in 28 minutes. Well, we didn't quite do that, but the software came to be known as ZViz, and it's been used extensively at Lucasfilm internally for the past 10 years or so. What you're looking at here is the ZViz interface with some assets from the movie Red Tails, which George directed, what year that was. ZViz is really two programs in one. It's a 3D animation program and a film editing program, and those two programs sort of talk to each other. Just to outline, the basic workflow for a layout artist is to get all your assets together, all your characters, props, sound, stage the action, get your camera set up, record your clips, and then in ZViz, you pop over from the 3D animation portion into the editing portion, and you cut a sequence together. So you can build a whole sequence that way. So here is ZViz. And now I'm stopping the animation, and I'm navigating with the camera into this airplane. And I'm going to go select the character there. This was about the Tuskegee Airmen, this movie. Now I'm posing the character. I can go grab pose controllers, record the clips, and then switch into edit mode. And you can see I'm dragging a clip and dropping it into the timeline. And then you can edit your clips. It's very much like iMovie, if you know iMovie. Oh, and then we can trim them, and then I'm just kind of scrubbing through the timeline and looking at the clips that I've recorded in the 3D part of the program. So each animation studio is a little different. ILM and Pixar tend to have a lot of proprietary software that they write themselves and maintain and develop themselves. Other studios just get off-the-shelf software, programs like Maya, where sometimes it's a mix of these kind of programs. The interface for 3D animation software can get very complicated. It's pretty deep stuff. So it's very important to design it in such a way that you don't clutter up your interface. And we tried to keep that in mind when we were developing ZViz. Here, oops, oh, I've skipped ahead. Well, so we're going to click, click, click with my mouse to create a path for the character. And then you can apply poses to the character. Or you can just grab, like I said before, the pose controllers and pose the characters however you like. And then you can save those poses up to a pose library. And then you can also attach one object to another. So that's Anakin, and I'm attaching a lightsaber to his hand. So you just grab the lightsaber with your mouse, and you drag it, and you can rotate it, position it, and then hit the attach button. And then when I move the hand, you'll see that the lightsaber will go with the hand. This is a virtual camera. You can pan the camera and track around with the camera. You can crane up and down. You can tilt. You can dolly in and out. And you can see also in the upper right-hand corner, you're seeing what the camera's seeing. So you could operate the camera in a third-person view, at the same time looking through the camera in a little view window. Even though we have a modeling department, sometimes layout needs to get going on something and the model isn't quite ready or some part of it isn't ready. So we have a simple modeling program. So you can quickly sketch up. There's a program called Sketchup, and this is sort of based on SketchUp. It's a way to quickly create 3D models. So you might need to create a little building. And then later on, that can be replaced by the real asset down the line. Another feature of ZViz is sketching. So you can actually, with your mouse, sketch if you need a texture, like Rango's supposed to have a mustache or something, and they didn't put that in. So you can do that. And then you can attach your sketch in the 3D world onto the object. So it can be a stand-in for an asset. And this is a sketch I did for Rango's tongue, because we didn't have a tongue that animated like that. And that's the stand-in for the final animation. At ILM, we do a lot of stuff up in the air. We got a lot of flying things going on. So we created a grid system. This is some layout footage from Red Tails. We created a grid system of horizontal and vertical grids. So you can take an airplane and put it up on the grid, and that way you can orient the airplane to the ground. And then the grid also serves as a surface on which to build a motion path. So you can click, click, click with the mouse as I'm doing here, and it creates a path. And then you can remove the grid and reshape the path to create the flight path that you want. Have the airplane attached. And then in a minute you'll see that we'll attach then the camera to the airplane and hit the play button, and off we go. Now, I said earlier that the layout artist is like the cinematographer of the CG world. But there's one big difference, and that is that layout generally doesn't do lighting. That's a pretty big difference, because lighting is a big part of cinematography. Well, we have a lighting department that does that. The one exception is when there's a story beat that involves lighting. So if it says Rango steps out of the shadow, or in this case, the clouds part as Rango has his realization, then the the lighting sort of echoes his dawning realization of something. So we have a lighting system in ZViz. And you can see over on the left, I'm kind of turning the light and it's changing the direction of the shadow. So in those situations where we really need to do lighting, we'll do some simple lighting pass and then send it down the pipeline. All right, so far I've talked about layout in the context of animation, but there's other areas where layout plays a role. There's pre-visualization, which is layout, but as planning for live action films. There's layout in films that blend live action and CG animation. And then there's layout for computer game cinematics. Filmmaking is very expensive, which is why studios do a lot of pre-production planning. When you go out on set or on location, you want to make sure your film crew can be very efficient and economical. That's why people did storyboards. There's a long tradition of storyboarding as planning for live action films. But virtual reality and 3D animation have completely revolutionized film planning. So now, instead of just doing storyboards, we can actually pre-visualize a scene in 3D. We can stage the action, we can shoot the footage, and we can cut the shots together to prove in advance that a scene is going to work cinematically. So this form of filmmaking is called pre-visualization, or Previz for short. So the Previz process is essentially identical to layout, but it's used to plan for a live action shoot rather than just being the beginning of the animation pipeline. So here is some footage, Previz footage. There's a company in LA, actually there's a lot of companies in LA that are doing Previz as Previz studios. There's one called Halon, and this is their Previz for World War Z. You can see it's just animation at a little bit higher fidelity than layout sometimes is, but it really just depends on the layout. So there are different kinds of Previz. This is some working Previz for turtles that I did a few years ago. It's just your basic, what I would call working Previz. It's just going to loop here. There's no lighting, there's no visual effects. It's just proving out the timing and the framing of the shot. And then there's something called pitch viz, so called because it's used to pitch an idea to a client. So for that, you want it to look a little nicer. Pitch viz includes lighting, depth of field, camera shake, motion blur, all the goodies that give an image visual richness. So this is more Halon footage, but this is for the movie Red Tails. Layout also plays a part in films that blend live action with animation. Films like Pacific Rim, Iron Man, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, all the Marvel movies, which are really, where many of the shots involve nothing but CG characters in a CG environment. CG, I should probably define what that is. CG is computer generated, or CGI, you may have heard that, computer generated images, which is a term that actually annoys me because it makes it sound like you just press the button on the computer and you get generated images, which is like saying, here's a hammer generated house, right? No people were involved, the hammer did it, right? So no, people do, it's just a tool. So let's take a look. These are a few clips from those movies I just mentioned. And the common denominator is that everything in there is CG. The water, the robot, all the dripping stuff, the lighting, the light stuff, the city in the background. Nothing is real in this shot. Nothing is real in that shot. Snow, the trees, the Jeep, the turtle, of course, all CG. Now let's take a moment. We're going to look at some footage from Pacific Rim. Technically speaking, layout on movies that blend live action and CG animation isn't really previz because it isn't really planning for a live action shoot. It's really just regular old layout, but for a film that looks very realistic and that has some live action elements. So we're going to look at some storyboards from a sequence that I worked on Pacific Rim in storyboards, and then layout, and then the final footage. So we got our robot Jaeger fighting with a monster, kind of gorilla-like. Now this, as I say, was a film that had live action and CG. So when we cut in, this is inside the robot. And then we cut outside the robot, and that's all CG. So this, as the film, you'll see in the final film, it's always cutting back between live action and CG stuff. So those were the boards, the board animatic. And this is the layout. The set, by the way, is based on a real location in Hong Kong. So layout animation is crude, but it's all about just getting the framing and the timing right. All right, now let's look at the final footage. So, layout also has a role to play in cinematics or cutscenes for games. A cutscene is a short animated or non-interactive animation that will pop up from time to time in a computer game. Sometimes it's used to introduce a new challenge, or to advance the plot, or to provide clues, or to provide a kind of reward at the end of a level. Each cutscene is basically just a short animated film, and as such, it goes through the same production pipeline as any other animation, which includes layout. So I'm reaching back into the archives of LucasArts here. These are all cinematics from LucasArts games that I was involved with. This is something called RTX Red Rock. Nobody ever saw this game. Or nobody bought it anyway. And in Star Wars. Just for fun, here's a little layout for a cinematic that introduces a game level for a game called Sam & Max, which was one of LucasArts' big games. By the way, this version of Sam & Max, as often happens with games, got canceled in the middle of production, so this never made it to the light of day, but let's take a look.
Well, that was a waste of time.
I can't believe the commissioner sent us to mediate a potato carving contest.
That's the fourth boring assignment this week. If I don't see some two-fisted, non-vegetable related action soon, I'm going to consider re-upping with the French Foreign Legion.
You and me both, Max. Hello.
Generally speaking, there are two fundamental approaches to doing layout. I've kind of described one, starting with storyboards and so forth, but there's actually more than one, but I'll talk about two approaches. And at the end of the day, when the movie is finished, you may not be able to, I can't tell which approach was taken, but the process of getting there is very different depending on how you work. You can work on a shot-by-shot basis, building each shot to match existing storyboards, or you can work on a sequence basis, which is to stage the action for the whole sequence and then derive your shots out of that. The shot-by-shot approach is what I've described so far. It's the traditional animation method. The layout artists work from Storyboard Animatic, which is put together in the editorial department under the director's supervision, and then it's layout's job to try to follow that blueprint as much as possible. The sequence approach, on the other hand, comes out of more of a live-action approach to filmmaking. In this system, there are no storyboards, there's no animatic. The layout artist is just given a script and a voice file, and then based on the timing of the voice file and the action described on the page, they stage the scene, and then once the blocking is done, they cover it. What's called coverage is just to shoot it from a lot of different camera angles. Usually start with an establishing shot, which is a wide shot, and then go into medium shots and close-ups. So the pros and cons, the traditional approach, you have the animatic, it provides the blueprint, and it makes the process of doing layout very streamlined. You know what you got to do, you just got to match that. With the other approach, it's more open-ended, but the advantage is that you can find shots that you might not have imagined in your head as 2D, but you discover them in a 3D work process. So Rango was done on the shot-by-shot basis. Gore Verbinski, the director, wanted layout to stay very close to the storyboards. Things like headroom, like the distance from the top of a character's head to the edge of frame, the way it was on the board was the way he wanted it in the shot. We have something called a layout turnover meeting with the director. When you're starting a new sequence, the director comes in, he hands over the sequence essentially to layout, and Gore would go shot by shot and say, well, in this shot I want a 35 millimeter lens and a 21 millimeter lens, and I want it to be like this, and don't forget, notice this, notice this. So, the work on Rango was very restricted for layout, but did win the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, so can't complain about that. Let's take a look at a storyboard animatic for the saloon scene in Rango.
Glass of water.
Might get a double!
And now this is the layout. Hopefully you can see that we kept pretty close to the boards on this. Use low poly models at this stage of production.
I'd like a glass of water.
He wants a glass of water!
Making a double!
Give us the
To help layout follow the storyboard compositions, we have a ZViz feature that allows you to overlay the animatic on top of your 3D view for animation. So here we've got our 3D world, and then the storyboard image, which we've basically attached to the camera. And now as I move the camera, I can frame the scene as it's composed in the storyboard. Like tracing. Now, the Clone Wars TV series, on the other hand, was done using the sequence approach. So on Clone Wars, there was no traditional 2D story department, and therefore there were no storyboards. Instead, the layout department was called the 3D story department, and the artists who worked there were called 3D story artists. But essentially, layout was combined with the story department to create a 3D story department. So on Clone Wars, the 3D artists worked directly from the script, just as 2D story artists do, but instead of drawing, they would stage the action of the scene in the 3D environment. Once the action was blocked in, then it was covered from a variety of camera angles. And the recorded clips were then cut together in ZViz edit mode and formed into a shot sequence, which is then delivered to editorial. So where a traditional story department will deliver storyboards to editorial, the 3D story department delivered a 3D layout. This was George Lucas's vision for how stories should be planned. He was not a big lover of 2D storyboards. It was probably because he come from a live action background. He really believed in staging something and then finding your shots in that process. There's a story about George going to Singapore to open a new animation studio, and he was given a tour and led into a room, this big room that was described as the story department, where you could put up all your storyboards. And George said, there aren't going to be any 2D storyboards in my studio. That's how committed he was to working in 3D. So here's a layout from an episode of the Clone Wars. As I've said, it's not really possible to tell that this didn't start as boards, but it skipped that step and went directly into 3D. Where do layout artists come from? Well, I'll talk a little about my background. I got an art degree at UC Santa Barbara, and I got an MFA, and then I had a career as just a landscape painter for about 15 years, and I taught painting and drawing at a couple colleges down on the peninsula. And then I got the idea that I wanted to not spend all my time alone by myself in my studio. I wanted to collaborate with other artists and do something else. So I got a job at a game company doing background painting for games, and then went to LucasArts and did the same there, and then started actually learning how to do 3D. And instead of painting backgrounds, I actually built environments. And then I heard about this weird profession that they had going on over at Pixar called layout. I thought, well, that sounds great. I want to do that. So I applied, and I got hired at Layout, and I did A Bug's Life, and Toy Story 2, and Monsters, worked on those movies. And then I went back to games, but as a cinematics director. And so I directed a bunch of little movies that popped up all through the games, and that was fun. And then I want to get into film, so I applied at Lucasfilm, and I got a call asking if I'd be interested in working on this crazy project to do this software development with R&D. That sounded good, because by that time I realized what I wanted software to do for me in my line of work. And it sounded like we were kind of in alignment on that, so I did that. And while I was working, that took like 10 years. Took a little longer than I thought it was going to take. But while I was helping develop that software, I also got involved in production. So I worked on the Clone Wars TV series, And then on Rango, what else? I worked on, I wrote these all down here. Rango, Pacific Rim, Turtles, and also some Disney rides, some Star Tours rides, and then some virtual reality stuff recently. We're starting to do VR at ILM. So I came from a fine art background. Some people come from a film background, or photography background, computer science background. And those different kind of backgrounds tell you the kind of skills that you need. You need to be able to compose pictures. That's a good, the fine art background kind of gives you that. Photography teaches you about lenses, because oftentimes you need to know about how actual physical lenses work. Filmmaking teach you about editing and storytelling. And then the computer science background gives you the technical side, because there is a technical side to this, which is my weak side. But I managed to stumble through it and figure out all the technical stuff that I needed to learn to do what I wanted to do. Other qualities of the layout artist, the ability to collaborate with other artists, a willingness to take direction. Film business is very hierarchical. There's a director and everybody else is there to make his vision come true. You also have to have the ability to come up with creative ideas and offer them, and then have it be okay if they say no. You need good manners, diplomacy, and you need enthusiasm for both creative and technical challenges.
We're rehearsing a scene for the upcoming company play called Put That Thing Back Where It Came From, or So Help Me. It's a musical. Yeah, put that thing back where it came from, or so help me. So help me, so help me, and cut.
The job of layout is to stage the action of the film in a virtual environment and then compose shots with a CG camera. The layout artist creates simple poses that indicate the key points of action. Character animation is kept to a minimum, but the timing and the shape of each pose is very precise. Particular attention is given to the camera. The action is carefully framed, and the camera movement is polished to a high level. As I've said, the layout artist uses the tools of the cinematographer: character blocking, framing, lensing, camera movement, and point of view to depict the story and express its mood and its meaning. Good camera work in live action and in animation seems, or should seem, utterly natural. The audience should feel as if one minute it's looking at some detail of some object, and then in the blink of an eye, cut, they're looking at a panorama, and it all feels just right. When done poorly, the audience will lose its emotional connection with the story. It'll become bored and restless. But when it's done well, the audience remains engaged. It sees what it wants to see, what it needs to see at every moment of the story. So if the audience feels informed, entertained, and satisfied at every moment, then the camera work is doing its job, and no one is aware of it. That is the goal of layout and cinematography: to be effective and to go unnoticed. Thank you very much for coming. Questions? Yes, sir.
From a very, very, very lay perspective.
Yes. Okay.
When I think of filming, I think of a group of actors and a director saying, do this, do that, and camera recording all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So in its most simplistic way, is what I'm about to say accurate? Animated filming is a camera taking pictures from on the screen of a computer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, pretty much. The screen and what you see on the screen is controlled by a virtual camera. So it's really very much like there's a 3D world in the computer. You can navigate around in this 3D world just like I'm walking around this podium. I can navigate with the camera around what is apparently a 3D object in the computer. And I can set keyframes for objects so that they move and in a predictable way on a certain timeline. And I can do the same with the camera. And once I've got that arranged the way I want, I hit the button and it records frame by frame, 24 frames a second, the action that I've animated in the 3D world. And that's essentially what animation is, what 3D animation, 3D layout is. Yeah.
My question is, the layout person sets the scene and moves the camera around, all these other things, and also moves the characters. My question is, do the animators then take what you did directly and just refine it, or do they start over?
It's a good question.
And also kind of a sub-question is the rig you use to do your poses the same one that the animators use?
Oftentimes we use so he's asking about rigs. The rig is, these 3D models have a kind of a bone system in them. And that's what you use to pose. It's like an action figure, you know. You can just pose it however you want. And then by setting keyframes at intervals, what the computer does is interpolates between the different poses, and that's how you get your motion. So we often use a simpler rig and layout just because it's lighter. Sometimes animation is very complicated rigs. We don't tend to do facial stuff, so we don't need all the facial rig. I can't remember the first part of your question.
The first question was, if you're doing all this work to move the camera, are you just taking that, refining it, or are you starting over?
They tend to take the camera exactly as we did it, and they'll often use our animation blocking as a template to guide their animation. Different animators work different ways. They'll set keys in different ways. They'll rig things up in their own personal way. So oftentimes they don't want to use our animation because they have their own style, but they will take our timing and our blocking because that's been approved by the director. So they have to match what we've done visually and then, and make it more interesting to look at than what we do. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I just have a more basic question. You mentioned a couple times that the job of the layout is to get the timing and the framing right. Can you define framing?
Yeah, it's a composition. So it's this. It's how how things are arranged in your four walls of your frame. And there's different formats. So there's a widescreen, or you probably saw as we went through here, some were more square, some more rectangular. That becomes your frame, and you compose to that, just like a painter does. But like I said, things keep moving in our frame because it takes place in time, so you have to be constantly changing where you're positioned or how you're following things so it remains a pleasing composition.
Oh, and that has to be very precise then.
Yeah, right,
okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's somebody back there, sorry. You'll be next, young man.
How heavily do layout artists focus on the composition of the piece before the animation team hits it? Because usually composition is the biggest part of the animation process, but with the simple rigs, it's a bit harder to get the exact, detailed parts to the composition, like lighting and whatnot.
Yeah, well, we're pretty precise, but it depends on the shot. What I'm thinking about is oftentimes we won't pose hands. It'll just be a hand that's kind of like this. On the other hand, if it's a close-up of a hand doing something very precise, we will pose it. So it really depends on the composition, but in the traditional pipeline, the composition starts in story. We're trying to match that as best we can, although, like I was saying, sometimes when you get into the 3D world, you realize we can't do that because things don't line up the way you expect. But no, we're trying to be very precise about the composition. Of course, we do crude animation, so in between our poses, we're not going to get every single frame exactly like the animators want, but they don't want us to do that anyway.
Like if you do just sequence posing like you did for the Star Wars, is there someone who comes in to check the compositions while you're doing the layouts of the poses?
Not while, but we'll have regular reviews with the director. So we'll, typically a team of layout artists will, maybe there's 50 shots in a sequence. We'll divide it up between 3 layout artists. We'll each get a chunk of shots. We'll work on those for a couple weeks, and then we'll have a review with the director, and he'll say, oh, no, that's not working, let's change that. And oftentimes, he'll have a Cintiq, and he'll actually draw on top of our images and say, make the head bigger or whatever, and we'll get notes, and we'll go back and revise. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you get something rigged? You know, to like, you know, move just by.
Well, there's a rigging department, and it's one of the dark arts of animation. I don't know how they do that. No. So there's a modeling department, and they'll model a character, say, and then there's a technical process by which you arrange a kind of a spine inside the character, and you build it, and you decide where the joints are going to be and how they're going to bend. And there's, you know, computer tools that allow you to do that. But it's very complicated, actually, and it is kind of a dark art. I mean, those guys, I don't know how they're doing it. All I know is when I get it, I can pose the character the way I want. Yeah, any other questions? I see there's one up here, too.
So what's the most enjoyable project you've ever worked on, and also what's the most satisfying project you ever worked on? They may be the both, and why?
Well, I'm very proud of Rango. I thought that turned out great. It was sort of a model of production organization too, meaning they really worked their storyboards hard before they got to us. So they had planned that thing out to the frame on those animatics, and they didn't deviate very much. So in a way, so I'm proud of the film. On the other hand, it's kind of fun when things are a mess, because that provides for creative opportunities. In Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I'm working on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 right now. Number 1 was a huge mess. They couldn't decide what they wanted, and so it was like, you know, do something. So I got to, you know, kind of play director and have a lot of creative input, and they would reject 5 of my ideas until they finally got something that was interesting to them. So, you know, it depends on the project, but I did enjoy that. Yeah.
How long does it take to do, let's say, an hour's worth of completed animation?
Well, you're talking about like almost a movie's length. 3 years. You know, movies take 3 or 4 years to make now. Pre-production, the story development process takes a long time. Once you really get into production, meaning you've got all your 3D stuff and you're actually doing what we do, it's about a year, or a little over a year, to get your 90 minutes, which is a typical animated film. Yeah. Some questions up here, I think. Or, yes, whatever. There's a lady here, over there.
You have like a wonderful resume, and I was just wondering, from your experience, what elevated you or made you different than other layout artists? That
Endurance, longevity. I just hung around longer. No, I don't know. You know, I got lucky, honestly. When I got involved in this business, layout, I started in like '97. They were like, if you're an artist and you can compose a picture and you're kind of interested in doing the computer stuff, we'll train you. They don't do that anymore. Now now people go to school and they learn how to do layout in school. There was no layout, 3D layout, before Toy Story. So I did kind of get involved early and was lucky that they were willing to train me, and I grew up sort of in the business.
Is there any kind of particular education you would recommend for someone who wanted to do 3D animation and gaming?
Well, you're saying gaming. You mean the animation for gaming? Yes. You know, animation school. I mean, you know, fine art is always good. Being able to draw is still important, because animators, often they plan their animation themselves, even if it may not be storyboards, they'll draw to work out the animation that they want to do in 3D. But yeah, animation school for sure. And there's a lot of great animation schools out there. It's a tough business, but there's jobs.
I was just curious, is your line of work something where you're hired to do this movie, or is it more like you're just sort of an employee, ongoing, salaried kind of thing?
The latter. I mean, I worked at Pixar, and now I'm working at ILM. The difference between those two things is at Pixar, you're in a layout department, and they have their own original movies, and you go from movie to movie, and it's all in-house. ILM is a studio for hire, so companies come, say, we're making the movie, and we want you to do these 467 shots. So it's a little different, and yeah, and I just bounce from project to project. People try to put me in a place where I'm doing stuff that's interesting to me and that I'm good at. But yeah, we just go show to show. Yeah.
So in computer class, I do a lot of animating in Flash, which is really frustrating because it likes to detach all the limbs at all times. Does that happen in what you do?
Detach the limbs at all times?
Like, I'll be trying to do a walk cycle, and as it's walking, its forearm move one way, and its upper arm will spin it in an entire circle the other way, no matter how many times I go in. I'm like, no, child, do not do that.
I haven't used Flash, so I would have to look at the software to see what's going on. It sounds like some, do you use animation curves in there? Do you have kind of a graph editor or a curve editor?
It's Adobe Flash.
Adobe Flash. I don't know if Adobe Flash.
It doesn't really do much. It's like, well, if you move the limb and then you tell it to go here, it'll end up here, but we're not going to tell you how.
Yeah, okay.
It's more two-dimensional.
Yeah, I know that. You need to be able to look under the hood and see what's going on down there.
You talked about layout in different instances, but can you talk about layout in VR? Because you said you're mentioning in VR.
Yeah, that was a little strange because, in VR, so layout for VR was really a kind of Previz thing. It was blocking out the action that was going to happen. So VR is virtual reality, and that's the latest cool thing. And we're doing some of that kind of work at Lucasfilm. So there was a project we did that's kind of a Star Wars related project, and we needed to figure out what the player was going to do moment by moment through the virtual reality experience. So I blocked out all the action. What's strange about it is there's no cameras in VR. I mean, with VR, the user, the participant can look anywhere they want at any time. So you're not framing anything, you're just making stuff happen like a stage play. I didn't really like it that much, honestly, because it was not what I'm good at. Yeah. Michael, right up here. Yes, sir.
So in CGI, I imagine that you can draw things out and store those images. But when you blend CGI with live action, what's the source material of the live action? Do you go out and shoot the scene?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, we have a live action plate. It's called a plate, which is basically live action footage. So, you might, like for that Red Tails, I don't know if you noticed that. So you would say shoot, let's say you have CG airplanes flying over a building. So you go out and shoot, no airplanes, just shoot the shot that you want to have happen. Imagine there's airplanes there. Shoot it. Then you bring that back to their studio and you put the fake airplanes into that shot. And there's a process for doing that. There's something called Matchmove, which is, it's kind of difficult to explain, but it's basically a way of reproducing a camera move that you did in live action in the computer with a virtual camera. And once you get that established, then you can put in your CG elements and they'll match the plate.
Can you create more live action from just a short sequence that's stored? In other words, like you store 5 seconds of the sky. Can you make 30 minutes out of that?
You can. I mean, there's a limit. You know, you can stretch animation, but it is frames ultimately. So, you know, you'd have to find in between frames to make it work. There's a limit to how much you can stretch an animation or a live action footage.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up. I do have one question for you, though. You know, having been involved in games myself, and you did games as well. You know, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the things that you have to do kind of are all based on director's direction,
right,
and so forth. But I know that it was very difficult when you were doing games to not be able to sort of put something of yourself in those games, right? And typically we call them Easter eggs.
Right.
So I imagine that in the work that you do, that happens as well. So is there an Easter egg, let's say, of you know, of something that you've done that kind of stands out for you?
You know, you don't sneak things into a movie without the director seeing it. It's not quite the same thing. You know, I've managed to get shots through that I composed that were my idea. That Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle shots where they're running across the roof and then they jump down and they go down. And if you've seen the first movie, they jump down and they go down through the pipes. And it was a very long, complicated shot, and I worked on it forever and managed to get that past Michael Bay. So I feel good about that. All right, thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure. Hey, what's that? Yes, I did. I'm sorry, I just found a flash guy, so.
Well, I know this.
Yes, those things fall apart.
Sometimes more literally than others. Thank you.
Good luck. Hang in there. Hang in there. Hi.
I wanted to say thanks for coming. I'm Jamie Cook. We're working really hard to beef things up.
Hi.